Well, softwood lumber has been a major trade irritant between the United States and Canada for decades. The Prime Minister has indicated he's hoping for a resolution and that it will be a key part of any trade deal with the Trump administration. But achieving that is likely going to be a very tough task. Until then, the federal government is moving to help softwood producers. Mark Carney is in West Kelowna today, and he outlines some of the challenges and the new supports for the industry.
2/3 of Canadian lumber production and nearly 90% of Canadian lumber exports currently go to the United States, leaving us disproportionately exposed to their trade actions. This dependence creates costly uncertainty. It weakens our industry's ability to weather downturns. We'll provide up to $700 million in loan guarantees. This will ensure that forestry companies of all sizes have the competitive financing they need to maintain and restructure, if necessary, their operations during a period of profound transformation.
CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick was listening in to the Prime Minister, and she joins us now live from Ottawa. So, Megan, what else did we hear from the Prime Minister?
Well, he made a couple of other announcements in addition to the $700 million in loan guarantees that companies of all sizes will be able to apply for. Those are to help companies that are under immediate pressure. He also announced $500 million of grants for companies in this sector. And that money could be used to help what the government says is supercharge their businesses. So to help them with different product development, for example, or market diversification. This is a big focus right now for the federal government, looking beyond the U.S. For trade partners and business investment. And so part of this money will help companies in Canada in this sector do just that. Also mentioning how Canada will prioritize using Canadian lumber, just like it will prioritize using Canadian steel and aluminum and other Canadian products in what are being called these big nation-building projects that the provinces and territories and the federal government are working on. But another thing he was talking about is this Build Canada Homes program. This is something he promised during the federal election campaign. He said today this will launch in the fall. So he put a season on it, but not an exact date. But this is a new program that he says will help create domestic demand for lumber products as the federal government helps create more homes faster in Canada. So he was talking about that as well as new initiatives, again, to help companies diversify. So really the federal government helping the forestry sector with marketing and promotion to sell their products around the world. And then also some money for reskilling programs. Now, the Prime Minister said despite best efforts, it could be a possibility that people will be losing their jobs in this sector. And so they will spend $50 million with reskilling and upskilling programs to help upwards of 6,000 workers in the forestry industry, if need be. And this is not unlike money that was dedicated to steel workers when Prime Minister Carney made a series of announcements in Hamilton, Ontario, Steeltown a few weeks ago. There was also similarly money dedicated to helping workers in that sector as well. So a series of measures, some kind of like the ones they announced for the steel sector, but some different ones as well.
And Megan, what did the Prime Minister have to say about trade talks with the United States?
Yeah, no surprise he was being pressed for some details on where things stand with obviously that deadline of August 1st coming and going with no deal reached. And so some tariffs going up to 35% from 25%. Canada still has the exemption under CUSMA, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, or with Mexico, sorry, Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. So goods that are compliant with that are not facing the higher tariffs. But Carney last week had said he was disappointed that those tariffs had escalated. He was asked today if he had spoken with Donald Trump recently, and he said no, he had not, and that they will speak when it makes sense, was his response to that question. He was also asked whether Canada plans on retaliating with any more counter tariffs now that there was this escalation, and there's still those hefty tariffs on certain sectors like steel steel and aluminum and other goods. And his response to that was that Canada was always going to apply counter tariffs sort of where it made sense. He said where it would have the maximum impact in the U.S. and minimum impact on Canadian businesses and Canadian consumers. So he was saying it's not an automatic adjustment. If their tariffs go up, then Canada's counter tariffs go up. Rather, he says the approach Canada is taking and seems to continue to be taking is looking at ways to support the industries that are impacted. So today is the softwood lumber sector. A few weeks ago, it was the steel sector. So premiers like Doug Ford, who have been calling on Carney to fight back with dollar for dollar tariffs, might be disappointed to hear that answer. The steel industry, very important in Ontario, under 50% tariffs, and Ford has been calling for 50% tariffs on U.S. steel. Did not sound like the Prime Minister is too keen to do that. And he also mentioned how, yes, the issue of softwood lumber has been brought up in the context of trade talks with the United States. And he said that's adding to the complexity of those negotiations. And he also was saying, Natasha, that, yes, other countries have been making deals with the U.S., but he noted that some of those agreements have included commitments from those countries to make massive investments in the U.S. And he said Canada is already the second biggest investor in the U.S. in the world. And he said that amount of investment likely to go down if no agreement is reached.
Okay, CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Ottawa. Thank you, Megan. Okay, so for more on this announcement and waiting patiently alongside with us is Kurt Niquidet. He is the president of the BC Lumber Trade Council. He's joining us from Vancouver. Kurt, thanks so much for making some time for us.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's our pleasure, sir. So I understand you were listening alongside with us on what the Prime Minister has to say and the announcements he's just made. So I'll begin by asking for your initial reaction.
Well, I think it's helpful. It's appreciated a lot. It's a challenging time, and we've been working actually with the federal government for quite some time on potential support measures. And so I think most of this is ticking the box. I'll have to look at the details, but certainly is helpful and appreciated.
Let me ask you about the sense of urgency. We've been hearing from others in this industry that this is a dire situation and people are really feeling the hits from the tariffs already. Did you get that sense of urgency from what the Prime Minister had to say today?
Well, I think certainly with some of the liquidity supports, that's going to help on the urgency side. But I think we really are looking in terms of addressing the issue is getting a negotiated settlement with the U.S. And so I think that still needs to be front and center and made a priority. And so I think that is something that we're looking for, and we'll be continuing to work with the federal government on potential options. But in terms of addressing that short term, some of the liquidity supports are very helpful, and as well as helping some of the support for workers. The diversification, as well as sort of growing the market within Canada, that is helpful as well and welcome, but that's going to be more of a longer term initiative.
Well, even if a deal is struck, and I hear you because we hear this from so many people, even if a deal gets struck between Canada and the United States, there's no guarantee that the tariffs on softwood lumber are going to get lifted. So to that point, we know that the Prime Minister has a short-term plan with lots of money, a long-term plan, but he's also talking about becoming Canada's own best customer. Now, part of the concern in previous years has been lumber comes into this country, despite how vast our own supply is. The concern becomes if you block a country like China or limit a country like China from bringing in its lumber into Canada, that we could be hit with further sanctions or tariffs coming from the Chinese economy. So are you concerned at all about that and how the federal government would have to balance that?
I don't think that's really much of a concern. We don't import much lumber into Canada. I think we're really mostly an exporter. There's a little bit of imports of some very specialty products, but I think for the most part, we're a net exporter by a long ways, and so certainly growing our domestic market is helpful, but we have to accessing the U.S. market is critical. Over the longer term, it's great to sort of grow our domestic market, and I think even without the trade issue, I think diversifying our markets, particularly to the Asia Pacific regions, is important and something we've been trying to pursue for quite some time. So this is welcome. But again, some of these diversification efforts are really addressing sort of a longer term strategic play. And in the short term, the U.S. is very important for certainly for British Columbia. 75% of our exports are destined to the U.S.
And Kurt, on that point, we've heard from U.S. President Donald Trump say at least a few times, we don't need their lumber, they being us. So put that into context for us. What is the reality of America's dependency on our lumber?
Yeah, in reality, the U.S. only supplies about 70% of their domestic consumption needs, and they're importing 30% from elsewhere, and the vast majority of that is coming from Canada. So any sort of restrictions that they are going to be putting on in terms of duties or additional measures, that has an impact on them because they can't just readily replace that supply. And so typically we see price responses in the U.S. market, and that has impacts on the affordability of the materials and affordability of housing.
Okay, Kurt Niquidet, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Natasha.
You're welcome.